This 1867 portrait of a teacher looks peaceful until you notice the empty desk. At first glance, it seems like a normal photograph. A calm woman in dark clothing sitting beside a chalkboard, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It looks like the kind of image you might see in a book about post-war American education, plain and quietly inspiring, until one small detail refuses to be ignored. Her name was Rachel Okonkwo, and she had been cataloging photographs for the Virginia Historical Consortium for 11 years. The collection had arrived in early March, donated from the estate of a family whose bloodline ended with the death of a 93-year-old man in a Richmond nursing home. There were 14 boxes filled with tintypes, carte de visite, and cabinet cards, most of them ordinary. Stern fathers, children stiffly posed with rocking horses, wedding photographs where no one smiled. Rachel had handled more than 40,000 images in her career. She understood the visual language of 19th-century photography the way a translator understands grammar, and something about this photograph simply did not belong. The woman in the image sat inside a small schoolroom. Behind her, a slate board showed a few chalked letters, partly erased. To her left stood a small wooden desk, the type made for one child, with an inkwell set into the corner and a hinged lid for storing slates and primers. The desk was empty. No child sat there. No books lay on its surface, and yet it had been placed with care inside the frame, angled toward the camera as if someone was meant to be seen there. Rachel adjusted the archive lamp and leaned closer. The teacher's face was calm, her posture exact, but her eyes were not looking at the camera. They were fixed on the empty desk. She had seen memorial photographs before, images meant to honor someone who had died, but those usually showed something meaningful. Flowers, a black cloth, a framed picture of the person being remembered. This desk was simply bare, and the longer Rachel stared at it, the heavier the absence felt, as if the photograph was not just showing a teacher, but pointing to something that should have been there and was not. She turned the card over. On the back, written in faint pencil, was a single line. M. Caldwell, teacher, Hardin Cumber, 1867. No first name, no school name, just initials and a place. Rachel set the photograph aside and told herself she would return to it later, but by the time she locked the archive that evening, she already knew she would not let it go. Rachel had never planned to become an archivist. She began in fine art conservation, spending her 20s in climate-controlled rooms repairing Renaissance panel paintings and 19th-century oil portraits. After a fellowship at a small museum in Charleston, she was drawn into photograph preservation and then into research. The object itself was only half the work. The other half was understanding what you were actually seeing. She had gained a reputation among her coworkers for what they called the long look. She was willing to sit with an image for hours, days, even weeks, until a missed detail finally revealed itself, a reflection in glass, a shadow that made no sense, a hand holding something just outside the frame. Most photographs from the 1860s were carefully staged. Every object was chosen for a reason, yet many scholars treated them as neutral records, as if the camera only captured what happened without intention. Rachel knew that was not true. Every photograph made a claim. The real question was what it was trying to hide. The Caldwell image pulled at her because of its contradiction. Memorial photographs were meant to express grief, but this one did not feel like grief. The teacher sat too straight. Her face was too controlled. If anything, she looked defiant, and the empty desk, placed so carefully, felt less like sadness and more like blame. Rachel returned to the archive the next morning with a notebook and a magnifying loupe. She removed the photograph from its sleeve and studied it under angled light. The surface showed the light silvering of age, but no serious damage. It was a professional piece, likely taken by an established studio. She tilted the card and caught a faint embossed studio mark in the lower right corner. Peton and Hale, Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk, not Hardin County. The image had been taken nearly 200 miles from where the pencil note placed Mrs. Caldwell. That meant either the teacher had traveled or the photograph had. Either way, this was not a simple school portrait. Rachel searched historical directories for Norfolk and found Petton and Hale listed starting in 1866, a commercial photography studio on Main Street near the harbor. The business operated until 1879, when a fire destroyed the building and most of its records. No client books survived, but the studio mark confirmed the time period. The photograph had been taken between 1866 and 1879. The pencil note said 1867. If that date was correct, then M. Caldwell sat for this portrait just 2 years after the war ended, 2 years after emancipation. Rachel paused and studied the teacher again. The woman's skin was light, her features softened by the wet plate process. Her dress was simple but well made, suitable for a schoolteacher. Her hair was pulled back beneath a plain cap. Nothing about her appearance marked her as anything other than a respectable white woman of modest means. But Hardin County, Virginia, in 1867 was not a place where respectable white women commonly taught school. Before the war, the county's economy depended on tobacco and enslaved labor. After emancipation, the Freedmen's Bureau opened schools across the region, staffed mostly by black teachers and northern missionaries. If Mrs. Caldwell had been teaching in Hardin County in 1867, there was a strong chance she taught in one of those schools. And if that were true, the empty desk meant something much darker. Rachel contacted a colleague at Howard University, a historian named Dr. Leonard Mosley who specialized in Reconstruction-era education. She sent him a high-resolution scan of the photograph and the inscription, and asked whether the name M. Caldwell appeared in any records of freedmen's schools in Virginia. His reply arrived 2 days later and was longer than she expected. "The name appears once," he wrote. "Mary Caldwell, listed as a teacher of colored children in an 1867 report from the Freedmen's Bureau office in Hardin County." The report stated that her school operated out of a converted barn on the edge of land formerly owned by a man named James Whitley. The school enrolled about 30 students between the ages of 6 and 14. It closed in the spring of 1868. Rachel read the message twice. A school that lasted only 1 year. A teacher mentioned once and then gone. She asked Mosley if he knew why the school closed. "The report doesn't explain," he replied. But that was common. Freedmen's schools faced constant danger. Fires, violence, threats. Some teachers were driven out. Some were killed. Sometimes the end came quietly. Sometimes children simply stopped attending. He attached a scan of the original report. Rachel opened it and found the line. "Mrs. Mary Caldwell, teacher, conducted a school of 30 pupils until the spring of 1868, when enrollment declined sharply and the school was discontinued." Enrollment declined sharply. A dull phrase that explained nothing. Rachel returned to the photograph and stared again at the empty desk. It was small, meant for a young child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old. The inkwell was dry. The lid was shut. As she leaned closer, she noticed something she had missed before. Near the front edge of the desk was a mark, not a stain but a carving. 2 rough letters scratched into the wood. E. Rachel searched census records for Hardin County, looking for children with those initials who would have been the right age in 1867. The 1870 census listed many families, but matching the data with Freedmen's Bureau records narrowed the list. One entry made her stop. Eliza Whitley, age 9 in 1870, formerly enslaved, living in the household of James Whitley, the same man whose land had housed Mary Caldwell's school. Her occupation was listed as domestic servant. A 9-year-old domestic servant in 1870 meant she would have been 6 or 7 in 1867, the year the photograph was taken. Rachel felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came when a story began to take shape. A child's initials carved into a desk, a school that closed when enrollment collapsed, a teacher staring at an empty seat. She needed to know what had happened to Eliza Whitley. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Dr. Mosley connected her with a legal historian at the University of Richmond, Dr. Catherine Fra, who had spent years studying the apprenticeship system used in Virginia during Reconstruction. Apprenticeship was the loophole, Dr. Fra explained over the phone. The 13th Amendment ended slavery except as punishment for crime, but it said nothing about children. Southern states moved quickly to take advantage of that silence. After the war, legislatures passed laws allowing courts to bind black children to white employers, often their former enslavers, as apprentices. The excuse was always the same. The children were said to be orphans, or their parents too poor, or their homes unsuitable. In reality, the system allowed white landowners to take free black children and force them back into labor under conditions almost the same as slavery. The child's wishes did not matter. Dr. Fra said the parents' approval was often ignored. A judge could sign the order, and the child would be taken. Sometimes families fought back. Sometimes they won. Most of the time, the system worked against them. Rachel asked whether records from Hardin County still existed. Some should, Dr. Fra said. County court records from that era are scattered, but a few survived. 2 weeks later, Rachel sat in a rural Virginia records office, turning the fragile pages of a leather-bound book of court proceedings from 1867. The clerk had warned her that the index was incomplete and that much of the handwriting was hard to read. Still, halfway through the volume, Rachel found what she had been searching for. In the matter of the minor child Eliza, formerly the property of James Whitley, now claimed as apprentice by the same. The filing was dated November 1867. It stated that James Whitley had asked the court to bind Eliza, age 7, to his household as an apprentice until she reached 18. The petition claimed the child's mother was dead, her father unknown, and that Whitley was willing to provide food, shelter, and education in exchange for her labor. But the record also noted an objection. A woman named Mary Caldwell had appeared before the court to challenge the apprenticeship. She stated that Eliza's mother was not dead but had been sold away before the war and was believed to be living in North Carolina. She also said that Eliza had been attending school, was doing well under the care of the freed people's community, and that binding her to Whitley would deny her education and place her back into a life of forced service. The court's ruling appeared on the next page. The objection was denied. Eliza was bound to James Whitley. Rachel sat quietly in the records room and felt the full weight of what she had uncovered. A teacher had gone to court to try to save a student she had already lost. After that failure, she had gone to a photography studio in Norfolk and posed for a portrait with an empty desk beside her. The image was not meant as a memorial. It was proof. It was a teacher saying, "This child was here, this child mattered, and this child was taken." Rachel brought her findings back to the Virginia Historical Consortium and asked for a meeting with the curatorial board. She wanted to reframe the photograph and create a small exhibition that told the story of Mary Caldwell, Eliza Whitley, and the apprenticeship system that stripped thousands of black children from their families after emancipation. The meeting did not unfold as she hoped. The director, a cautious man named Harold Vance, listened with his hands folded as Rachel explained her research. When she finished, he asked how confident she was in the identification. "The initials match," Rachel said. "The dates line up. The court record names Mary Caldwell directly as the objector. But we don't have final proof that the woman in the photograph is the same Mary Caldwell," Vance replied. "We don't have another confirmed image of her. We are making an inference. We are interpreting," Rachel said, "which is the work of curators." Another woman from the development office raised a different issue. The consortium had recently received a large donation from a family foundation tied to old Tidewater wealth. Not the Whitleys, but families like them, families whose fortunes had been built on plantations and enslaved labor, fortunes that now funded museums and universities. If the consortium mounted an exhibition accusing those families' ancestors of re-enslaving children, the donors might withdraw their support. Rachel felt her jaw tighten. "So we keep the photograph hidden because it might upset donors. We have to be careful," Vance said. "We have to present history responsibly, and that means avoiding claims we cannot fully prove." The meeting ended without a decision. Rachel was asked to prepare a longer report for review. She left the building and walked several blocks before she trusted herself to speak. That evening she called Dr. Fra and explained what had happened. The legal historian was quiet for a moment. "There may be another way," she said. "If Mary Caldwell fought the apprenticeship in court, she likely also contacted the Freedmen's Bureau. They kept complaint records. If she filed something, it might still exist. Those records are held by the National Archives. Rachel submitted a request and waited. 6 weeks later, the response arrived. It included a scan of a handwritten letter dated December 1867, addressed to the Assistant Commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau in Richmond. The letter was signed Mary Caldwell. "I write to report the unlawful seizure of a child from my school," it began. Eliza, aged 7 years, was taken by court order and bound to Mr. James Whitley, who held her mother in bondage before the war and now claims her labor under the name of apprenticeship. I appeared in court to object and was overruled. I respectfully ask that the Bureau investigate and act to restore the child to freedom. The letter continued for 2 pages. It described Eliza's progress in school, her skill in reading, her wish to become a teacher one day. It described the conditions on Whitley's property, where Eliza had been forced to work in the kitchen and fields. It spoke of fear in the freed people's community, of other children taken, of the growing belief that emancipation had been a false promise. "I do not write only for Eliza," Mary Caldwell concluded. "I write for every child in this county stolen from their family and returned to bondage in all but name. The law has failed them. I pray the Bureau will not." Clipped to the letter was a short note from a bureau clerk, referred to local agent for investigation. No further action on file, no further action. Rachel read the letter 3 times. She could hear Mary Caldwell's voice in the careful words, the controlled anger, the hope pressed down beneath formal language. She understood then why the teacher had gone to Norfolk and sat for that photograph. She had done everything the law allowed. She had lost. So she created something that could not be burned, ignored, or quietly dismissed. She left a record meant to last. She made sure someone in the future would see the empty desk and ask what had happened to the child who once sat there. Rachel returned to the board for a second meeting, this time bringing the letter, the court filing, the Freedmen's Bureau report, and a clear timeline linking everything together. She also brought something else, a living descendant. Through Dr. Fra's contacts, she had reached a woman in North Carolina named Denise Whitley Monroe, a retired school teacher whose family traced their roots to enslaved people in Hardin County. Denise's great-great-grandmother was a woman named Louisa, sold away from Virginia in 1859 and separated from her daughter. The daughter's name was Eliza. Denise had grown up hearing the story. Louisa spent years after the war searching for her child. She wrote letters, hired agents, and traveled to Virginia twice. She never found Eliza. She died in 1902, still looking. My grandmother used to say, "Eliza was the ghost in our family," Denise told the board over video, "the one we could never bury because we didn't know what became of her. And now you're telling me there was a teacher who tried to save her, a teacher who went to court, wrote letters, and took a photograph so someone would remember." She paused, her voice heavy. "I want that photograph shown. I want people to know Eliza existed and that someone fought for her, even if they failed." The room was silent. Harold Vance looked again at the image on the screen, the calm teacher, the empty desk, the faint carved initials. "All right," he said at last. "Let's do the exhibition." It opened in October under the title The Empty Desk, Education, Apprenticeship, and the Theft of Black Childhood After Emancipation. Mary Caldwell's photograph stood at the center, enlarged and softly lit, with text explaining Eliza Whitley's story and the system that took her. Nearby were copies of the court record, the Freedmen's Bureau letter, and a family tree tracing Eliza's descendants and the long search that followed her disappearance. Denise Whitley Monroe spoke at the opening. Standing before the image, she talked about finally having a moment in time that proved the story was real, a moment when someone had refused to accept what was happening. She spoke of her grandmother, who kept Louisa's photograph on the mantle and retold the story every Christmas. She spoke of the thousands of children taken through apprenticeships that were never challenged, and of the silence that settled once Reconstruction ended and federal oversight withdrew. "This photograph is evidence," she said, "but it is also resistance." Mary Caldwell could have walked away. She could have gone north, found another job, or let the system win. Instead, she sat for this picture and left the desk empty. She made sure we would see it and ask why. And now we know. The exhibition ran for 8 months. Regional newspapers covered it, and a public television crew produced a documentary segment. Scholars cited it in studies of Reconstruction labor systems. A high school teacher in Richmond built an entire unit around it, having students research apprenticeship cases in their own counties. Rachel watched from the margins and felt something unexpected. Not pride exactly, but a sense of completion. A teacher had once looked at an empty desk and refused to let it be forgotten. An archivist, a century and a half later, had finally understood. After the exhibition opened, other historians began reaching out. They shared images from their own collections with similar signs. A family portrait from South Carolina where a child's wrists showed faint marks beneath lace cuffs. A plantation group photo from Louisiana where black workers stood arranged like a burial detail, taken the same week a newspaper reported violence among freed people. A daguerreotype from Maryland showing a young black girl standing behind a white child's chair, her hand resting on it, while the shadow on the floor hinted at a chain not visible anywhere else. Every photograph was a layered surface. Every image from that time carried intention, meaning, and concealment. Cameras had been tools of power, used to present order and respectability, but they also captured things they were never meant to show. A misplaced hand, a revealing reflection, an empty space where someone should have been. Rachel returned to her work changed. She began teaching workshops on reading 19th century photographs for signs of coercion, resistance, and erasure. She built a database of images marked for deeper study. And above her desk, she kept a scan of Mary Caldwell's photograph, the teacher's steady face in the waiting desk. She thought often of Eliza, the 7-year-old who carved her initials into wood, learned to read in a barn, and was taken by court order back into forced labor. The records never said what became of her. She did not appear in later censuses. She vanished into the silence that swallowed so many black children of that era, children who were not recorded as dead, only worked until they disappeared from history. But the desk remained. The photograph remained. The letter remained. Mary Caldwell's voice carried across generations, saying, "This happened, it was wrong, and I tried to stop it." That was the truth of archives. They held silence as much as sound. They preserved absence alongside presence. And sometimes, if you stayed with an image long enough, the silence began to speak. Rachel thought about the portraits hanging in museums, the respectable families, the dignified ancestors, displayed without anyone asking what was missing. She thought of the children cut from frames, the workers posed as background, the violence hidden in plain sight. Every photograph made an argument, and most argued that the system was natural and fixed. Mary Caldwell made a different claim. She placed an empty desk in the frame and dared the future to ask why it was empty. It took 150 years for someone to ask. Rachel wondered how many other questions were still waiting, in archives, attics, church basements, and forgotten boxes. How many empty desks were still out there, waiting to be seen? And she went back to work,